Wait, where? What? I'm in a box!
Oh no. No, not the box.
This is the Escape the Zoo podcast. With your host, Daniel Clark.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Escape the Zoo podcast, where we talk everything wildlife. Today's guest is Carl Safina, whose resume is absolutely stacked. His writing about the living world has won a MacArthur Genius Prize, Pew and Guggenheim Fellowships. In addition to countless awards and medals, his writing has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Audubon, National Geographic, Huffington Post, CNN, and a bunch more. He has a PhD in ecology from Rutgers, hosted the PBS show Saving the Ocean, and runs the nonprofit Safina Center at Stony Brook University. He is also the author of 7 books, including Song for the Blue Ocean, and we spend the majority of the conversation discussing his latest, Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel, which discusses the similarity between human and non-human consciousness, self-awareness, empathy, emotional intelligence, etc. It is an examination of humanity's place in the world and calls us to reevaluate how we interact with animals. I'll link to all this stuff in the show notes, but let's get right into it. Without further ado, here it is, my chat with the one and only Carl Safina. Well, Carl, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. I'm a huge fan of your work and super excited to talk because your latest book, Beyond Words, What Animals Think and Feel, is a topic that I always come back to because I feel that it's really the largest disconnect between the general population and the natural world, is our understanding of what animals truly do feel and what their level of consciousness and emotional intelligence is. And by misunderstanding that, I think it allows the general population to develop this lack of empathy that really permeates in how we treat animals in the world. So would you mind talking a little bit about what the book is about and what drove you to choose this topic specifically to dedicate your time to writing a book about?
Sure. Well, the subtitle is What Animals Think and Feel, and that's what the book is about. And I approached it by telling the stories of some actual free-living elephants and wolves and killer whales in different parts of the world, actual individuals in their family groups, and bringing in a lot of research and science in addition to the action that I was observing there. And as far as why I wanted to do that, it's because basically because of what you just said. You know, who we are here on this planet with is incredibly disunderstood and non-appreciated. And we live in a very, very rich living world. We're also doing a tremendous amount of damage to that world. Mm-hmm. So appreciating or not appreciating has huge consequences for them and for us. So I wanted to talk about that a lot, and ever since I was a very small boy, I've always understood that other animals have lives, and I've watched a lot of those lives at some very close range. So that's why I know that they do.
And when you started beginning the research to tackle this project, how did you go about trying to answer that question? What do animals think and feel? And were the results surprising to you? Did you learn that they were more capable of emotion than you originally anticipated, or was it more being able to prove what you already knew through your observations in your previous work?
Well, in the big picture, I think it was just showing what I've already learned for my whole life, from the time I was 7 years old and I had a flock of homing pigeons, through the time I used to train hawks and and then the research that I did on seabirds. So it's a lot of stuff that I've seen for my entire life. But I think there are three really good ways of understanding what animals think and feel. One is scientifically you can consider evolution.
Mm-hmm.
The other is that you can look at their brains. You can look at what brains do and compare brains among various animals and ourselves. You can investigate the brain waves and the functioning of living animals with a lot of the tools that we have nowadays, and people have been doing that. And you can simply watch what they do and look at how much sense it makes and understand that they share many of our emotions because they do things that we understand in contexts that make total sense to us. So when they're playing with their family members, they look like they're having fun because they are. They don't look like they're fearful or confused. They don't look like they're fighting. But when they're fighting, they look like they're fighting. When they're defending, they look like they are in a defense mode. When they're fearful and being very circumspect, or they're running away, they act and they look like they're fearful. So it's not like we can't make any sense of what they're doing. We can, because most of our brain functions, the basic ones, are identical to theirs.
Yeah, and I thought in your TED Talk, which congrats on, by the way, I think it's over 2 million views right now.
Thank you. Yeah.
Something crazy like that.
Yeah.
You alluded to something that I thought was really important because I had always been told the opposite, which was it goes into what you were just saying, which is people have spoken about how you shouldn't I can never say that word properly. Anthropomorphize.
Anthropomorphize. Everybody who knows nothing about animals knows that one word.
Yeah, it's like you shouldn't
it's quite remarkable.
Anthropomorphize animals and try and instill human emotions and identities into them because they're not human. Why should you do that? And when you were in the TED Talk, you go through some photos and you're explaining how you can clearly understand, like, these animals are playing, these animals are fighting, these animals are stressed out and running away from something. And it is very clear. I mean, it's the same thing.
Well, it's a different thing, actually. I don't project human emotions into animals. I see what they do and I make sense of it using everything that we know. And one of the things we know is that we're all biologically related and our brains evolved from exactly the same place. We have a vertebrate brain. All vertebrates have the same kind of brain. We have the same kind of brain hormones that create moods and motivations. We know that we have those things. So then to deny that they have the experiences that we know are created with that hardware and those chemicals is not scientific. But if you see, let's say, a good example is, let's say you see elephants mating,
Mm-hmm.
and you see the male and the female chasing around, and they're doing what they do before they mate, and then they mate. And somebody might say, "Oh, isn't that beautiful? They're in love." But elephants do not have any pair bonds. After they mate, they separate. They don't hang around together at all after that, and the males don't provide any parental care at all. So I would not say that they're in love. I would say that they definitely are feeling lustful feelings and sexual motivations, but that feeling of being pair bonded, they don't have as a sexual thing. They have it as a family thing. They have very deep emotional family bonds. But so if you watch what they're doing and you know what their lives are like, you are not likely to be projecting your own life into them. You're likely to be interpreting what you're seeing.
Right. And what I also think is interesting is typically, before I started educating myself more in animal behavior, you would always assume the larger the animal, the larger the brain, the more likely there's parallels to the human emotional side of things and the human brain function. And then I spent some time working with seabirds in Hawaii and started understanding the intense, like, monogamous mating pairs and how they work so hard together as a couple to raise chicks.
Right.
And then you look at something like that, and something you typically equate to having a bird brain, quote unquote, which is a negative connotation, does have the capacity for love. Even, I don't know if it's more so than an elephant, but certainly differently than an elephant.
Well, they certainly have a capacity for sexual pair bonding that is much more than what elephants have, because elephants simply don't have that, and seabirds do. I actually just spent the entire morning reading science papers about the convergent cognitive functions, in other words, intelligence, of mostly birds of the crow family and apes, and the bias that we have both implicitly, because the apes are more closely related to us and look more like us, and explicitly, because we kind of keep telling each other that they're more intelligent because they're closer to us. But if you simply look at what they're capable of doing, ravens and apes, ravens, gorillas, chimpanzees, they basically are capable of doing exactly the same kinds of things. So they, even with a much, much smaller brain, but the thing about bird brains is the neurons are much smaller, so they pack a lot more into a smaller space. And as far as what they need to do that involves what we call intelligence, which is basically things like social skills and problem solving, they simply perform just about identically, and basically their intelligence is on exactly the same plane. If you simply look at their performance in different tasks and in different experiments that measure similar kinds of things.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
I know the crow and the raven are really touted as the most intelligent or being ability to problem solve of the birds, but is that something that broadly applicable across all bird species, that they typically have similar capacities to at least using tools or solving problems comparatively to apes and humans? Or is that strictly something that's unique to the crow and the raven?
I don't think it's true across birds. I think that the crow family and the parrot order are quite different in those regards, as far as behavioral flexibilities and social skills. I think they're quite different. I think with parrots, one thing with parrots that is different is parrots seem to me to be able to go into rages in a very mammalian kind of way, is something that we would really recognize as being enraged, whereas I've never seen that in any other kinds of birds that I've had or worked with. I do think that these different groups of birds have some different kinds of skills, definitely.
This may be an unanswerable question, but is there any hypotheses as to why certain birds developed so much more intellectually capable than others? Like why a crow or a parrot order would need more?
There are hypotheses, yeah, but proof is a little bit more elusive. But the first thing is you look at their social structure and see what they do. So with birds that live in flocks, where a lot of the flocks are kind of stable, where many of the individuals may have an opportunity to get to know who they are, who they are as individuals, see the same individuals over and over again, develop friendships, alliances, sort of reciprocal food finding, where, one day I follow you and the next day you follow me because I found something. And one day I didn't find anything. You know where the food was last night. I'll follow you. Those kinds of things. If birds are all spread out on their territories, then they're not as likely to have those kinds of opportunities or needs. So if you're in a fairly stable social situation, it's advantageous to develop social skills. And in the science literature, that is referred to rather diabolically as Machiavellian intelligence, which sort of puts a bad cast on it.
Right.
And sometimes it is used for, sort of negative reasons, like cheating somebody and keeping track of who has done you a favor or who has cheated you, or who you can rely on, or who is your rival in some ways. Who beat you in a fight, who beat your friend in a fight, things like that. So, primates live in groups like that, and so do some of the crows, and so do some of, and ravens, so do many of the parrots. But again, not all of them. There's a lot of variability.
That makes a ton of sense, and it kind of alludes to what you mentioned when you were looking at which animals to study in Beyond Words. You look at elephants, killer whales, wolves, and you compared that to animals that you didn't focus on, like herring and some basic species of fish, etc. And you distinctly name them the it animals versus the who animals. Can you explain a little bit about what that is in regards to the social structure?
Yeah, well, what I said, just as a way to sort of explain this, is that if you know who somebody is in your group, then you are a who animal. If individuals mean something to one another, those are what I call the who animals. And the ones where the individuals don't mean anything to one another, like one mosquito doesn't mean much to another mosquito. They're not friends. They're not in the same group. They're not traveling together. They have no relationship socially to one another. And the same could be said for certain schooling fish that travel in these schools by the millions, like herring or anchovies or something like that. Certainly not all fish. There are other fish where individuals do matter a lot, but and I would say that those fish are also who animals. You got to remember, there's like 30,000 species of fish. They do just about everything, but including breathing air. I mean, there are fish that do a lot of different things. So you can't make much of a blanket statement about fish or any of these groups. But that's the distinction I was making, is that for many animals, individuals matter. For many animals, individuals do not matter. So there's the who animals and the it animals in that sense.
And so when it comes to the ability for those animals to have intelligence, particularly emotional intelligence and feelings, is that something where you can make a blanket statement that who animals are typically the more intelligent animals that are experiencing those things? And
yes, you can make that statement. And in fact, one of the major leading hypotheses for the evolution of intelligence is that intelligence evolves as a social skill. If there's a social need for it, that's when intelligence evolves. But I didn't write the book to expound on a lot of scientific theories and speculations. We can dial that a few clicks back. I wrote the book to show people that that on this planet, the only living planet that we know of, there are a lot of creatures besides the ones in our own species who live a very vivid existence and who value their lives and greatly value the lives of their family members and their friends. And that they are having those experiences. Life means something to them. And in some ways it means more to them than it means to us. For instance, of all the shared emotions, some people say to me, well, do you know any emotions that we have that animals never have? Well, I don't know of depression in wild animals at all. I don't know of suicide in wild animals at all. in that sense, they seem to value their lives a lot all the time, whereas a lot of people don't. A lot of people would like to end their lives, and I don't know anything in animals that looks anything like self-loathing or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So the only emotions that I see that are really different in humans that I don't see any parallel of in other animals are sort of the worst ones that we have. And probably those are symptoms of civilization and living in our very, very crowded, overcomplicated, and often very alienating systems that we've built for ourselves. Probably don't have those things in small tribal groups either, where it's a close-knit band of people who all know and must support one another.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting what you said, which I hadn't thought of before, is that if you assume intelligence is something that really develops as social structures develop, the new civilization that we've developed, particularly in really urban societies, despite the fact that you're surrounded by millions of people, it's really, for many people, can be more isolating than anything that we've ever experienced in evolutionarily speaking. And I think for me at least, like, I always know that I always find my most happy moments to be when I have a feeling of belongingness to a group and a feeling of purpose within a group to achieve a bigger goal. And I think it's very easy, as you mentioned, to get alienated. And that's why a lot of those darker and more individualistic emotions are something that you're not seeing elsewhere.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, it's very clear that the best feeling that we can have is being connected, not alone or separate or isolated, but connected, and feeling like we're serving some larger purpose. If we feel that way, we're happy. And if we don't feel that way, we're not happy. But we're told all the time to be competitive, to be individualistic, and we live in often in these very dense cities that are completely anonymous and can be, ironically, can be exceptionally isolating and can make people feel not only unhappy, but if you feel unconnected and you don't have a feeling that you're serving a purpose, you can start to feel existential dread and panic, which many people suffer from.
Right. Yeah, and it is such an interesting. And then I was going to go down the whole technology aspect of things, but I want to stay on track because I could keep going on that forever. But when in your book, you really isolate it to, or decided to focus on three distinct groups of animals: elephants, killer whales, and wolves. What was the distinction you made for why you chose those certain animals? And I've always wondered this, and because most of the podcasts have focused on wildlife photographers who are obviously going out in the field and photographing, and is most of your work when you're writing these books, is it in the field, or is it like sifting through research papers, etc.? So when you decided to choose the Yellowstone wolves, were you out in Yellowstone day by day checking out their interactions, or was it more understanding the scientific literature?
Oh, it's a lot of both, but I start with the field work usually. And what I see in the field sort of is it becomes the framework for what it is that I want to dig deeper into in the published work. So, there may be lots of things I'm interested in digging deeper into, but if they don't cross and intersect with what I've seen in the field, they don't get into the written work.
Okay, that makes sense. Can you provide just an overview as to one example for each of those three: elephants, killer whales, and wolves, as to what is one specific large behavior that you witnessed within those specific species that really were like, oh, wow, you just can't debate whether or not these animals are feeling?
Well, elephants live in permanent family groups. They know exceptionally well exactly who they're with all the time, exactly like we do. They don't make any mistakes like that. they act very distressed if for some reason they get separated and can't find who they're supposed to be with. Like if there's maybe if they spread out a lot while they're foraging and a huge windstorm comes up so that they can't hear each other very well, and somebody loses track of where the family went, they act frightened and they start calling all over the place, and they definitely are having separation anxiety from their family. You can see that they have very deep bonds and they're very devoted to the group identity and to helping one another if there is any kind of distress. Wolves, many people have made a monster out of a thing they call a wolf that doesn't really exist in nature. Wolves in nature are not nasty, snarling, threatening creatures to one another. Within their family, which we call a pack, but it's just a nuclear family, they treat each other the way dogs treat us. And since wolves are the only ancestor of domestic dogs, we see that transference of their behavior, their loyalty, their identity, their defensiveness if there's any outside threat. And you can see that within the wolf family, the rest of the family defers to the parents, the two breeding wolves, the way that our dogs look for and defer to us. So that was very enlightening, I thought, and really interesting. The killer whales are a bit of a combination. In many ways, they live in these groups like elephants that relate to other groups around them. Like elephants know who other groups are and they can identify the calls, and they know hundreds of individuals. They say elephants never forget because that's true. And there again is a social intelligence that they have. And killer whales is a similar thing, but with killer whales, they also have this sort of in-group, out-group bias where certain communities of killer whales, which consist of many families, very, very strongly, actually completely avoid ever mingling with other communities of killer whales at the border. They're like different ethnic groups. There's nothing else in nature that is so much like the way that we are with other ethnic groups, that we consider these totally strange, people, that we can't understand them and we would never interact with them. The borders are really hardened. And killer whales are like that with certain other groups of killer whales, but within the group, they're just like one big tribe that mingle and frolic and mate with each other.
That's so interesting. And they have different dialects too, right? Between
different dialects, and and they also then they break up into their own family groups again. So they have they have a multi-tiered layering of their social structure. And again, they know exactly who they are. They know exactly where they are all the time, and they have huge territories. They can range for hundreds of miles, but they don't just wander around the ocean. They go to different certain places at certain seasons. They show up very reliably. People have known certain killer whales for 40 years, but at certain times of the years, those whales may be 700 miles away, and then the next year in the same month, there they are again.
It's crazy. And you told one story in your TED Talk about this killer whale, or several instances where killer whales have spotted research boats that they've recognized because they're out there all the time in a particularly heavy fog where the boat is lost, and actually guided them to shore.
Yes, there are two stories with two different scientists, one in the US and one in Canada, where they were lost in fog and killer whales appeared, and they followed the killer whales, and the killer whales took them not only to shore, but to their homes along the shore.
It's crazy.
So that's very, from how we understand the mental abilities of non-humans, we would say that that's bizarre. But if their mental abilities are actually quite similar to ours, and they do have much bigger brains than we do, and they are mammals, then it's not really very strange. We say, oh, that's bizarre and that's crazy. But, they've had these mental capacities since before there were humans on the planet. So there's nothing bizarre and nothing crazy about it. Our reactions are just symptoms of our total ignorance of who we're here with and what their capabilities are.
And don't you think it's strange that these animals that do hunt seals, they do have very interesting relationships with other species of whales themselves, that they must have some sense of what's going on with the fact that a lot of the persecution in the ocean is coming from us specifically? Why isn't there an aggression of animals towards humans when they see the destruction that's going on? Like you never see an elephant herd surrounding a poacher and like charging them, or you don't see.
Well, actually, I mean, in one sense, yes, you don't see them like going out and hunting down people, but there are very few animals that seem capable of revenge when the moment is right, and elephants are the ones that are most capable of doing that.
Really?
If somebody has done something very bad to an elephant, and this happens most often in a captive situation, an elephant may wait for years until there's an opportunity where that person lets down their guard, turns their back, puts down the tool, and then the elephant may do something as simple as backing into them and crushing them. And that has happened.
Whoa.
In circuses and zoos more than once.
Yeah. But a killer whale's never done anything to a human, right? Out in
a free-living killer whale has never hurt a human being ever.
Oh yeah, I forgot about blackfish. Blackfish got pretty dark. You have you spent any time looking into killer whales in captivity and what that does to them?
Well, I've seen killer whales in captivity in a few places, and I've read a lot about it. Yeah, that whale. There's sort of in the movie Blackfish, there's sort of two different things going on. One is about the whales and how intelligent they are and how much we've abused them. Right. And the other is about how in captivity the whales are too dangerous to the trainers and that it should not be allowed that we have these shows where trainers are put at risk in that way. And I think that gives sort of the wrong impression, because although on a factual basis it is true, in captivity killer whales have hurt very few people, but they have done that. But when you look at what's been done to them even in captivity, that whale Tilikum, that is the subject, that sparked the movie Blackfish by killing that trainer at SeaWorld, that whale had been unbelievably abused,
tortured,
and was probably essentially psychotic at times. And if you look closely at what happened in that moment, it appears that the whale and the whale missed a cue from the trainer and thought that he did what the trainer was asking. And the trainer did not reward the whale. And the whale basically
freaked out,
acted out by becoming aggressive. The whale got frustrated. It looked to me like the whale got frustrated and started to become aggressive to the trainer and got carried away. The whale, even then, the whale didn't go on an absolute rampage, but did get carried away and killed that trainer. But it wasn't like a random attack that even with this whale that was so abused and was probably psychotic at times, even in that moment, it didn't look to me like a random, irrational, totally unpredictable thing. It looked like a tragic occurrence where the whale missed a cue, the trainer did not reinforce, the whale thought it deserved to get a fish, and got frustrated, which in a way makes perfect sense. I mean, the people do things like that all the time. And people with post-traumatic stress disorder can have some cue that sets them off and they get violent.
Right.
The whales, for as many whales as many killer whales as have hurt people in captivity, which is a small handful, they're essentially very trustworthy, although they shouldn't, in my opinion, be in captivity.
No, I mean, and that none have ever hurt anybody out in the wild, and it's not like they don't have any interaction out there. I'm just shocked after watching Blackfish that people are still going to SeaWorld and that there hasn't been like a pure uprising against that. And that's like, to me, that there's a lot to be optimistic about in conservation. There's a lot to be pessimistic about in conservation, even more so at times. And that to me is the most clear. This is completely messed up behavior. It's basically like taking this incredibly sentient being and torturing them for 20 to 30 years. We're showing you this. It's killing people because of it, and people still don't care. Like it.
Yeah,
that
I know that's really true, and it's I share your frustration over that.
I mean,
and unfortunately, that's one of the reasons that. The reason I write and the reason I talk about these things is not just because I like to. It's because I think that it's surprising that with all that we know, there are still so many people who haven't gotten that memo or just don't care about it. And we, I think there's still a lot that needs to be communicated on a gut level to people so that they understand and feel it.
Yeah, and SeaWorld itself is based in California, which is a very progressive state. I live here in Los Angeles, couple hours from it. And I think what's so interesting is that society at whole continues to progress within our own species so well to be accepting of anybody, regardless of your race, religion, sexual orientation. And I think that's great. Everybody should be allowed to do whatever they want to do as long as they're good people and just to be able to be as individualistic as they'd like to be and be accepted for that. And yet we still don't place other species into that acceptance. And I think that's so strange. And I think it's going to get there.
I'm glad you think we're making such progress with people, because I think it's even much stranger how difficult it is with human beings, even in the United States. I mean, all the things you were saying about people being accepted, etc. That's true in New York, and it's true in Southern California. At least it's truer, but I'm not sure we would be thinking along those lines if we were black, for instance.
I think that's true, but I think you also have to zoom out, and from a sheer standpoint of, yes, there's still a lot of racism in this world, and there's still a lot of prejudice in this world. But comparatively to like the 1960s, and then comparatively to that, to the 1890s, it's certainly trending in a positive direction.
Yeah, but why does it need to take centuries?
Yeah,
it is.
Trust me, I'm with you on that. But I just I mean, my point is that like you'd like to think that we're in the best point in human history possible, and things are hopefully getting more accepting. But there's this disconnect when I hope people eventually care about other species the same way we care about other people. I just think unfortunately, I hope it's not too late when that shift starts to happen.
Yeah, and I think there probably is more of that caring and more of that understanding of people and other species than ever before. But boy, the progress is unbelievably slow.
Yeah, it definitely is. So to that point, when you look at your work, and I mean, even beyond specifically the book that we've been speaking about, you've done so much work around oceans and oil spills and conservation in general. Where do you feel that the world is at conservation wise? I know that's a very broad question, but for me, I'm somebody who's heavily invested in the wilds and natural world, and I want to support in any way that I possibly can. But it is sometimes hard not to get lost in the doom and gloom of everything. what keeps you optimistic, and what do you think are the closest and most opportune, or I guess the lowest hanging fruit items that people can start to check off to actually start to tackle and move things forward in a progressive manner?
Well, I think that's a much more complicated kind of topic than you mean to imply. But let me start with the worst part first, and then I'll get over to the best part.
Okay.
I'm old enough, I was in college when the big environmental laws were being passed, and the Wilderness Act and the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water and the Clean Air Act, and everybody seemed to understand that we didn't want to live in a toxic, polluted, and even overcrowded world. And that was the height of the environmental movement, and it has been declining and unraveling in a lot of ways for the last couple of decades as the gigantic forces that cause so much damage have figured out a way around most of this progress. So all one has to do is look at who is in charge of the EPA and the Interior Department and the Justice Department to understand how much backsliding and unraveling is going on. It's very dispiriting. Some of the lack of progress on the climate issues, the recent information about collapses of insect communities.
It's insane.
Throughout North America and Europe and a lot of Asia is unbelievable to me. I mean, if you don't have elephants, you can still have a lot of things. But if you don't have insects and you don't have pollinators, a lot is going to start crashing. And yet, where is the policy response? Where are the alarm bells? Everybody is still obsessed with waging war and white supremacy. I mean, those are like really the two things that I hear about the most. So those are the really distressing, depressing things, and those things are really going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, we've talked on the podcast a bit about the windshield effect. Have you heard of this?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, and for listeners, it's when you think of getting on the highway, going on the interstate when you're a kid and driving, you would just hit your entire windshield would always get hit by a bug every minute, just continuously covering up the windshield. And now you could drive for days and never hit one insect. And if there's nothing more telling about what's going on with the insect populations, that's it.
Well, the most chilling thing, one of the most chilling things I've ever observed in my entire life was something very simple. And that was, we usually in the summertime under all the street lights, there's a lot of bugs and moths and stuff. And usually there are bats going through the bugs and moths and eating. And I went out to dinner last August, right at the height of summer, with a friend of mine who's a really excellent naturalist. And we just parked the car near the restaurant, and we just started to walk to the restaurant. And he said to me, "Look at the street light." And I looked, and there was not one single bug in the halo of that light. And that, if you want to use the word bizarre, that is unprecedented. I've never seen anything remotely like that.
Yeah.
So those are the things that are really, honestly, very dangerous and terrifying. On the other hand, that's not what you asked me. You asked me what keeps me optimistic and gives me hope. And what does is that when I was a kid, before the environmental movement really took hold. When I was in my, when I was an adolescent, and I'm talking about, let's say, right around 1970, we had basically lost peregrine falcons and ospreys to DDT. And you could see where I lived, you could see osprey nests that were still in the trees from ospreys maybe 15 years earlier, that those ospreys did not exist anymore because they couldn't raise any young. The adults died and the population was erased. There were just none. I didn't see an osprey. Well, I was 15 when I saw my first osprey, and I didn't see another one until I was 21 years old. And I used to go fishing in the same place every weekend. So, I mean, I was where they were supposed to live. If you go to that place now, that same spot, because I have done this, you can see 10 ospreys in 5 minutes because there are like 4 active nests within a mile of each other. And I've watched things that look to me like an absolutely lost cause. And I've watched them really come back. In 1970, there was an article in the New York Times Magazine that was titled "Death Comes to the Peregrine Falcon." And I was kind of a hawk nut when I was a kid. So to me, I remember that article very, very well because it was like, this exceptional bird that I had only seen one of is gone. And that's it. Death comes to the peregrine falcon.
Yeah.
But luckily, there were still a few left, and the problem was DDT. And DDT and related chemicals were banned in 1972. In 1975, I started working on a project to reintroduce a few of the captive raised peregrine falcons, and then they started spreading back out again. And now it's decades later, mind you, right? So we have New York City has the densest nesting population of peregrine falcons known in the world. And in the summertime, we have ospreys all over the shore around Long Island. Anywhere you go, if you don't see an osprey, every hour, you just look up and you'll see one.
Yeah. It's like that Planet Earth 2 had the peregrine falcons in New York City, and that was badass seeing how those things navigate the urban world.
Yeah, those things are really incredible. So, to see things that I thought were totally lost causes come surging back makes me understand that when you think it's a totally lost cause, maybe it's not. But what made the difference is a few people did not give up. They kept hammering on what the solution needed to be, and it worked. So
yeah, I think
I'm sticking with that.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that too, because I think nature has proven time and time again that it's incredibly resilient and able to bounce back, whether it be when there's an established marine protected area or a certain species gets the time and attention and protection that it needs. I mean, to your point, I grew up on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and I remember even when I was a kid, seeing an osprey was like one of the more exciting things you could ever do. It was almost impossible. And now I went out on my brother's boat last summer, and you just see him all the time, just like diving around and hanging out on the ship masts and everything. And it's so exciting. And I mean, the California condor is a great example out here. I think there were like 15 left in the world. They captured them all, brought them to, I think it was San Diego Zoo, where they did a breeding practice.
Yeah, San Diego Zoo, right.
And I was out in Ojai camping last spring, and I probably saw 20 of them just kind of through my hiking. Well, it's awesome.
That's fantastic to hear. I think it was 1985, I made a special trip with a couple of friends from New York to a particular spot in Southern California because there were 6 free California condors left. There were, as you said, about 15 in the zoo, in the San Diego Zoo. And we said, we don't know if they're going to be able to breed them or put them out, or if they put them out, whether they'll survive. And we know there are 6 surviving ones, and we better go see a California condor because we might never see California condors for the rest of our lives. So we went and we saw 2 of those 6. it was a particular pass that they often came through. And we did, we stayed there for hours with a few people who were watching with spotting scopes and binoculars. And we did see two of them. I took one of the worst bird photographs of my life that day, but also one of the most important ones, a tiny speck of a condor in the distance with a very inadequate camera, what I could afford at that time. And anyway, fortunately, the people who really thought that the hope was breeding them in captivity and putting them back out, luckily they were able to do that, and luckily they were right. And at the time, there were a lot of people who give up hope. There were some leading environmentalists even who said that they shouldn't catch those last ones. They should let them die out with dignity. That's what some people were saying. And I was thinking, no, what are you, out of your mind? No.
I mean, it's the same thing going on with,
to bring them back. So.
With the Sumatran rhino right now. Jeremy Hans, who introduced me to you, has been doing a lot of work, and they're in a similar spot where I think they think there's like 40 of these Sumatran rhinos left, and just because of how geographically spread out they are, the chances of them actually getting to a healthy breeding population is almost impossible. But unfortunately, the first attempted capture to bring them into a breeding facility at the Cincinnati Zoo by WWF, the animal died just from the stress of the actual capture.
I heard about that.
And it created this whole thing where now everybody is like, oh, well, we don't want to be responsible for killing the last ones. We might as well just hope for the best, which is unlikely to be successful. But thankfully, I'll write in the show notes if I'm wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that they just successfully captured one, which is a good sign of hope. But I always just think it's so interesting how you look at these beautiful, magnificent animals like the California condor, like the Sumatran rhino, and ultimately whether or not they survive or don't survive is in the hands of a handful of few government people who probably don't really place too much of a priority in thinking about the topic in general. It's such a gift to the world, and it's been bureaucratically assigned to some random people to decide the fate of their entire existence. Is just such a weird concept.
Yes, that is a weird concept. Yep.
So what does the next 5 years look like for you? Is there another book coming out? Where are you going to decide to focus your time and energy? What are the biggest conservation topics that you're looking to tackle?
Well, I have a book right now that I'm finishing.
Oh, that's exciting.
I say that with some hesitation because it's already overdue, but I will have it. I'll have a draft done in a few weeks, and sometime later this year or early next year that will be out. 2 young adult versions of Beyond Words are coming out. The
that's
book
cool.
was edited down for young adults and split in 2. And the first of those is coming out I think it's April 23rd this year. And then probably around the same time next year, that second one is coming out. So I'll kind of have a lot going on with the books. I'm doing an article that should be out soon in the New York Times about generally endangered animals and declining wild populations. That will probably be out within a month or 2, I think. You never know with news and newspapers because things get bumped and things get delayed. But anyway, that's in the works, and I have lots more book files and lists of books I'd like to write. So I think what's in the cards for me is I'm going to just try to do as much writing as I can do. And unfortunately, I'm not going to run out of any material about the need to try to explain and defend what's happening with the natural world. So
how do you decide which topic to take on? I mean, if you have a list of all these different books, what is the most...
It's a little bit arbitrary. I mean, what I have found in the past is I have lists of books I'd like to do. And then when I look at the list, some of those ideas are not great. Some of them are good. Sometimes combining 2 or 3 ideas makes it good. And then something more topical and more timely seems to suggest itself, which makes a lot of what's on the list not as relevant. But it's not a scientific process by any means, deciding what kind of book to write next. And 3 books that I'm collecting a lot of information in files for are very, very different from one another, and I simply will have to pick one as the next one. So whether I'm going to pick the one that's, the best one I could have picked, or what will make me and the publisher decide to go one way or another, because I'm sure we'll talk about it, is a little unpredictable.
What is the book that you're finishing about?
The book I'm finishing is kind of a follow-on to Beyond Words. Beyond Words was about the intelligence and emotions of non-human beings. And this one is about what they learn socially from one another, and what counts as culture for non-humans, things that are not totally instinctive, that they learn as part of their own traditions.
Oh, that's cool. What is the typical lead time to that? So you finish a draft in the next few weeks. Is that something where it's 6 to 12 months out, or is it longer than that?
Yeah, 6 to 12 months out. Yeah.
Okay,
it's
cool.
usually more like 9 to 12 months. It takes a ridiculous amount of time after you're done for the book to actually appear, because there's editing, there's copy editing, there's several rounds of proofing, and there's long waits in between those things, because those get handed off to other people, and there's a queue, and it takes a long time.
If you could if you look back on your career, is there one defining moment when you were out in the field where you were could kind of get present to the fact that you just get to just be so happy that you enjoy doing the work that you do, or understand the importance of the work that you do? Is there one experience that really defines that?
No, there's like 200 experiences that define that. I think I appreciate more and more how extraordinary it is to have a life where I've actually been able to really watch, like for many, many hours as my job, what wild animals do. And I've always assumed, lots of people see some wild animals, and lots of people are very good birders, and lots of people go to see what's left of animals in the national parks, or get to go on a safari in Africa, or diving on the reefs and things like that. So it never seemed like just doing it full time was that different, but I'm starting to realize that it's very, very different from being on vacation, when you get to really immerse in observation, in reading, in thinking. And very few people, unfortunately, have had the experiences that I've had. So I feel, on the one hand, I feel very, very lucky. On the other hand, I wish I could share it a lot more with everybody. And that's one of the main reasons that I write, because that's the best way I can think of to share it with as many people as I can.
Yeah, and I think progression in general is really just allowing people to get out there and experience things. I mean, it's the same thing we were talking about, racial tensions, or completely neglecting entire species of wild animals. I think it's often just when you don't have experiences and fully understanding them, it's easy not to treat them properly or give them like the proper understanding.
Well, of course, it's like any body. If you don't understand who they are, it's not likely that you will treat them the way they need to be treated.
So I want to go real quickly into some recommendations. If you could recommend outside of your own, one book and one documentary that was wildlife/conservation related, which would those be?
Oh, geesh. That is, that's a hard question for me to answer.
Because you're like, all my books are by far better than everybody else's.
No, no, not at all.
No,
But
I'm just joking.
almost, the ones that had the biggest impact on me were the ones I read when I was young,
Mm-hmm.
and help make me want to make a life and a living out of this kind of interest and this kind of work. So they're old. So those books are very old, and I'm actually trying to think of fairly recent books about nature or the environment that I think are so killer, and I'm not quite coming up with much. I tend to read so much science stuff that I don't usually read the book forms. So,
It makes sense. I listen to a lot of podcasts, particularly around with like entertainment and comedians and comedy writers and things like that in LA. And they always say like when you're immersed in the work, it's really hard to then take your leisure time and watch a comedy series or a sitcom or anything like that, just because you almost you want to break from it to a certain degree, or you're spending so much time reading about scientific literature for your own books that it's just hard to ever turn that off.
yeah, I'll tell you who I think is probably the best living writing naturalist is Bernd Heinrich, Bernd Heinrich. He has really wonderful books about nature that often involve getting to know individual wild animals, and he's a spectacularly incisive observer. And I've gotten to know him a little bit, and he's that way in person as well. So I would say, there's a lot you can read about conservation all over the place. I mean, the fairly recent book called The Sixth Extinction,
That's a great
Elizabeth Colbert's book, that explains a lot.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
That's a very good book. Diane Ackerman has written some very good stuff. Those are like, they tend to be issue-oriented environmental books or conservation books. But as far as like, who we are here with, just getting to understand something more about animals and their individual experiences of living, I would say Bernd Heinrich is probably the best going.
How about documentary?
Hard to beat the BBC.
Yeah.
That work has just gotten to be so superb and really spectacular.
Yeah, it's hard to beat Planet Earth.
Yeah.
And then what about for folks listening who want to donate, whether it be to support your work or nonprofits that you really truly believe in their mission? Or is there a short list that you think are kind of the creme de la creme of looking into?
Well, I this question makes me very uncomfortable because I'm always likely to leave out somebody that I think is really important,
Mm-hmm.
and B, there are definitely a lot of groups that are very worthy of support that I don't know about, and it's impossible for me to mention. I like the Center for Biological Diversity.
Mm-hmm.
I like the Natural Resources Defense Council. I like Save the Elephants. I like a thing called Big Life Foundation. And there's There's the Friends of Yellowstone, which I have been um, a supporter of since I went there a few years ago, especially. So that I would say that that's some of the main ones on my short list. Ambicelli Trust is
Mm.
another one that's also elephant related. Um, there's the Laurie Marker's Cheetah Group in Namibia. Was the name of it escapes me now. I'm not sure if it's called Cheetah Conservation. There's the Snow Leopard Conservancy. I mean, there's really, really a lot, and I tend to be focused kind of at a big zoomed out level on some of those things. But there are a lot of local groups, and I think it's important for people to support what they like to support. You know, if you just like to support small local things, that's great. I'm not the fact that my list doesn't include small local things doesn't mean I think they're not very important. I mean, my group is a small group. It's not locally focused, but it's a small group. So a lot of the small groups tend to be nimble and very effective with a dollar. Um, so anyway, that's some of my thinking about that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And my last question is, if you could take out a billboard and plop it on the side of a major highway and put one message on there that disseminates one message in 10 words or less, what would that be?
Don't have more than two kids.
Yeah. Why is that? You don't
Well,
think
well,
overpopulation is a
by far, every problem in the world is either caused by or made much worse by the fact that there are way, way, way more of us than is good. I mean, you know, human beings are nice most of the time, but we are too much of a good thing. Food is nice most of the time, but you can eat too much. And there are twice as many people now as when I was born, twice as many. And when I was born, nobody was saying that the main problem with the world is not enough people. So all the problems that we have are really caused by and driven by the fact that there are so many of us, or made worse by that fact. And the biggest effect that we have on the environment is having a kid, you know, and that's something that should not be taken lightly. So it's a very important topic. And the other thing is that if you look at the countries that have stabilizing populations or declining populations, those are also the countries where women's issues and women's rights are the most advanced, where basically where women are full citizens and can own property and inherit property and own businesses and go to any level of education that they can get into and can afford. I mean, there's no institutional barrier
Oh wow.
to them. And so, really, the biggest social problem in the world is the relation between men and women, because that runs through all races and all countries and all ethnic groups. There's always that problem. And it's a stroke of luck that the one thing that solves that problem best which is equal rights for women, also solves the biggest other problem we have, which is 7, 8, 10 billion people is not something that the planet can bear. So, you know, when women simply get a choice, they they prefer small families, because the biggest secret of rich people is that small families create big lives.
Well, Carl, I'm a huge fan of the work that you do. I think
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
no, it's true. And I think Beyond Words is something that uh, has always been the strongest message that I've tried to put forth in the work that I do.
Mm.
And I think you summarized it or put it together in a book in a way that is so powerful and so important. And if people understood animals and wildlife from that perspective, I think it would really, really change the way that we make a lot of our decisions as a species in general. So thank you so much for taking the time. I'm super excited for the next book coming out in 9 to 12 months. Hope we can do it again. And for people listening, I'm going to link to all of Carl's, the nonprofit center, all of your personal website, Instagram, social channels, etc., in the show notes. So anybody that wants to, and obviously links to the books, anybody that wants to read more and get involved, help support, etc., please check out the show notes. And thank you for listening. Until next time, stay wild. Thank you so much for listening. I honestly cannot express how much I appreciate you taking the time. For all information regarding this episode's guest, social channels, books, how you can support, etc., please check out our show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please, please, please subscribe to the podcast. We are everywhere that you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Escape the Zoo on YouTube, follow Escape the Zoo on Instagram, like Escape the Zoo on Facebook, and please share with your friends. It honestly goes so far and means so much to me. And lastly, if you'd like to be emailed with each new podcast and any other major Escape the Zoo updates, visit escapethezoo.tv and sign up for our email list. Thank you.